Hello, welcome everybody. We're super pleased that you join us today. This is a special edition of a program that's called DevOps Unbound that we have on Techstrong TV. And every month we get together with you, a live audience, and talk about one of the topics. This one happens to be, I think, one that a lot of us are interested in. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started here. We're recording this session, goes about almost an hour. And we're recording that, and we'll be sharing that with everyone who is registered today to be part of this. You're welcome to share that with your friends and family who might want to say, hey, go check out this really interesting conversation. We also have some giveaways. We'll be giving away some Amazon gift cards. Those are things that we'll be contacting people after the webinar, after the roundtable. So our program is sponsored by Tricentis, great folks that do some very comprehensive software testing technologies, from mobile to cloud native to legacy, all of the things, all of the above. And they work with us in thinking about some of the topics and who speakers might be for our sessions. So let's get to our topic. Thank you to Tricentis for sponsoring this. We're going to be talking about responsible AI and software development and DevOps with an eye towards kind of regulators on the horizon, right? We have some recent things happening. We're not really quite sure what we're heading towards in terms of that part of it, but what are the things that software organizations should be thinking about when it comes to using AI in their software? Maybe they're developing technology for that. And as some folks are doing, by the way, please jump in. We love to have you chime in with where you're joining us from. So just type in your city, country, etc., and we'll go from there. So before we start talking, kind of getting into the topic, I want to have the panel introduce themselves. I'll go in the order that we did in our kind of little prep call right before. So tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and your background. So Robin, if you would do that first.
Absolutely. My name is Robin Yeaman, and I currently am the space domain lead at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon, the Software Engineering Institute, is an FFRDC, so I work pretty closely with the government as kind of a trusted partner. Prior to that, I spent 26 years at Lockheed Martin as a senior tech fellow. So I am a software engineer by trade, but I'm moved into kind of systems engineering. And I'm really excited to be here.
We're excited that you are here. Thanks for joining us. How about you next, Alice?
Hi, I'm Alice Chen. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Open Context. We make software that connects your people to your tech stack. Actually, more likely, it maps your people to your tech stack. And I've been working in the tech industry for about 20 plus years, and I've worn many different hats through my tech career. From engineering to operations, DevOps, QA, solutions architecture, that's just to name a few. And I specialize in designing and implementing systems to move data in and out. So get data moving, that's what I do essentially. And I'm really excited to be here too.
Well, both of you, wonderful experiences to have for this topic in particular. Mark, good to have you with us. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Mark Hinkle. I am the CEO of an AI consultancy called Peripety Labs. I spent the last 25 years in emerging tech, doing a lot in systems management, cloud, DevOps space, and now AI. I currently publish a newsletter called The Artificially Intelligent Enterprise, where I look at all this craziness going on from the standpoint of someone who is coming from enterprise SaaS background.
Excellent. Definitely check out Mark's newsletter. Maybe we'll drop a link here somewhere along the way, Mark, to share folks where they can, with them, where they can sign up, take a look. And last but not least, Martin. Martin, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mitch. Hi, everybody. My name is Martin Klaus. I'm with Tricentis. I run custom engineering, and we're focused on helping customers advance their quality engineering practices and adopt a more holistic approach to quality automation. And before my current role, I had various responsibilities relative to product marketing, product management, technical marketing, and solution architecture. And I also have a background in computer science.
Excellent. Very nice. Very nice. And thanks everybody for jumping in. Let us know where you're from here in the audience and our participants. And participants, important word, because we'd love to have you engage with us in the chat. We'd love to hear your reactions, thoughts, comments, what you're thinking about, when you like what Mitch said, or I don't like it, or I think this is a really good point, or what about, etc. There's also a QA tab where you can submit your questions. So we'll integrate that into the flow of our conversation as we go. So let's first start with, we're talking about responsible AI, and like many things, we put labels, we put names on things, and we use them, in all kinds of contexts. We don't necessarily have a common definition of what they are, and oftentimes there never is one. There's kind of a set of floating assumptions around what they mean. So we'll kind of come up with our own definition of responsible AI. But first, are there any sources that any of you are seeing as this is kind of a place we can go to look at? It's maybe not the authoritative by any stretch, or some places you've kind of seen where you like the definition that folks are using for responsible AI. So anybody jump in with their thoughts on this?
Just this morning, Mitch, OWASP is a nonprofit that we discussed earlier on, but before we started here. But they do a top 10, and today they launched a top 10, which was a checklist for governance and responsible AI and security that's brand new. I like them just because they don't have a commercial dog in the fight, and they usually have working groups and things that come up with a sort of industry enterprise neutral kind of look at things. So I think that's a good place to start for sort of application security. They're very much security oriented, but security is going hand in hand with explainable and ethical AI these days, just given the nature of the technology.
Great source. I happened across that this morning too. I was just reading that myself. Anyone else? Any other good sources?
I haven't seen anything that coalesced around one place. It seems, in my opinion, that it's moving so quickly, AI, especially the generative AI, that everybody's kind of reacting. So I'm not seeing one place. There's pretty interesting information, like you said, coming out of OWASP. I imagine NIST also has some things, but and then, as we were talking about earlier, most of the consulting firms are putting out some guidance as well. So you've got, Boston Consulting or MITRE or, Price Waterhouse, et cetera. But I'm not seeing one location.
Great. Anybody have a different experience? It's kind of where I am too.
Yeah, there's just too many sources, I think. Like it's too fast.
Yeah, it is moving fast. I'm working on a white paper with a customer that what we had last week is now out of date. So, it's a constant evolution. It very much is. Well, some of the things that I think a lot of things get labeled in or bundled in with responsible AI, disclosure, transparency around how you're using AI, maybe what models that you're using or external systems or reference data sources that you're using for it. Another aspect is the data that you're using. This is kind of right up your alley, Alice, with the data that you're using, customer data, how you're using it, the privacy of that, if you're sharing that with third-party models. Those kind of things. Anybody have any other sense of what we might mean by responsible AI?
Yeah, I see a lot of discussions and publications that sort of group together responsible AI with trust and risk, right? So these are almost terms that are used synonymously, and it almost always boils down to transparency and security and testing, and to ensure that AI is used in a responsible way relative to safety of citizens, inclusiveness, violation of, or not violation of biases or other sort of things that are outlawed already in terms of business conduct and ethical requirements. But the issue is that we just don't know yet exactly how some of these responsible, trusted, secure guidance can be applied, because we have not fully sort of understood what's possible with generative AI when you start to mix together learned and training data as it relates to generating new content, right? And new actions and new forms of creative work that, it's simply difficult to sort of predict what's going to happen down the road.
I think another thing about data is that we can't just track what's going in. We need to know how to get it back out. Like, because what if somebody, or EU currently has the a delete me policy, right? Like, if you want yourself deleted out of the data set, well, how do we do this for the model in the generative AI?
Very good question. Can you untrain the model for data I didn't want you to use? Or when we ask you to remove me from your systems, what about data you might have used?
And does that fundamentally change the model in any way?
Good question. I don't know if you can untrain.
Depends on the model.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It does depend on the model to some extent, but we have no idea what the cascading consequences are.
Yeah, I think the problem is that it's such a complex piece of technology. It truly is a black box. And while we know at a very high level how it works and what adversarial networks do and transformers do in general, it's like you and I, if we say we saw a train wreck or we saw something classified and the government says you have to unsee that, you also have to unsee that and be able to remove that from your future conversations. I think that's a real problem for us with LLMs. It is a roach motel in the sense that once the data gets in, it doesn't come back out unless, unless you saw the research that DeepMind did last week at Google by say the word poem over and over again forever, and it actually verbatim expelled training data. So, you're not supposed to be able to do that, and it happens. So I think that's the big takeaway, is such a complex thing that even the best intentions by organizations and engineers that put this together, it's such a complex thing that, and such a new thing that we're not 100% sure that we can guarantee those safety regulations or guidelines.
Yeah, and I think the ultimate question is how, with all these rules and guidelines and guidances in place, how do you actually enforce it, right? And I think, Alice, you talked about that in terms of, I want to delete my data, my copy, write it, content that's being used for training purposes, and I want to get it out. How do you enforce it? Who's going to enforce it? And how do you verify that it actually has been enforced?
Yeah, we'll go into the regulatory front too, of what some things might be coming our way in reference to that. One of the aspects of this, we talk about transparency. So what data are we using of yours, and how are we using it, and who are we giving it to, right? And then, of course, your question, Alice, about what if I want it back is a good one as well. As some kind of running the infrastructure technology for a company, I'm examining AI disclosure agreements that come from different providers. I happened to be looking at Zoom's this morning, which I thought had a pretty interesting approach. I mean, I don't know if I could say transparent because they don't go into great depths, but literally listing, here's the features in our AI component, in our software that you would use. And here are the models, our own and third-party models that we use for these individual features, and how long the data is retained by us and them. And also, just generally, we have an agreement that they don't train their models, third parties don't train their models on your data, et cetera. And a lot of other things in it too. I thought one of those that kind of made me think that's not a bad approach of how they laid it out. There may be other great ones, but what do you all think of some of the considerations that if we're building software that leverages AI, what do we need to disclose? What's responsible disclosure?
I almost think you want to share, based upon what you've seen in your models, the biases that are included, because we're starting to see, I forget, I was reading an article maybe last week about gender bias is showing up in the models everywhere. So there's probably a whole variety of bias, especially as we're, training them. We should maybe share that, hey, this is biased towards this because we use this set of data, things like that, so that people aren't just taking it verbatim, like they're actually using it in, based upon understanding its intent or where it came from.
You bring up a really great topic around bias, right? As well as Paul asked a question, which is right in line with what we're talking about, is DEI kind of considerations, who's the user base that this is trained on, and we can go into the copyright or ownership of data protection, also accuracy of responses, right? Those issues. Who's going to say something? I think I stepped on either Mark or Martin.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think this is really, and my background is in open source software, but this is one of those cases where I think this kind of technology this is a made for use case so that we can have the transparency of not only the way the software works, but the data sets that are used to train that software and the tests that we're going to use to determine whether that software is, exhibiting a bias. And when you talk about these large language models, there's the data, but there's also the weights that you put on that data to inform the way the model performs. And I think with Meta's Llama model that first came out, they had released the software without those weights and biases, and it caused it to not be as useful as it could be. And then later on, someone leaked those weights out to the internet, and now it's licensed under a transparent license where all of that is disclosed in open source. So I think one of the things that we have seen for all these fundamental parts of the internet that has been helpful is developing infrastructure software that has been open, like Linux, like the web servers, like so many things that we use today. And I think it's important, especially given the capabilities of this kind of technology.
Do you think, Mark, the disclosure mechanisms we have for open source, for example, security vulnerabilities around that, do we need the equivalent for some of the issues around AI? Like, here's an erroneous, we call it, when AI gives a incoherent answer, or what looks like a coherent answer, but is actually patently false, but it looks right. Do we need those kind of disclosures or something like that? Do you think will evolve?
I think we do, but I think we lack the general understanding of, today we know if there's a vulnerability that allows you to intercept PII from a data stream, you know what to do. But I don't even know if we as a sort of collective business users of this technology can actually have the right vocabulary to have an intelligent dialogue. But I think we need to do it. I just don't know that, you're going to need vendors who are good at that to help out with that. Maybe Martin has an idea.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that most of these AI models are, in fact, not just most of them, all of them, are non-deterministic, which means you cannot, run the same test and expect the same output or the same, pass-fail result, to simplify it here. And I think that's what makes it so complicated, that it's impossible to even anticipate all the potential responses or actions that come out of these models. It's not possible, mathematically speaking. And some of the things we're seeing, with companies or even like in industry, to say, well, if that's the case, if these models are non-deterministic, we might need to change our approach also from a testing and validation standpoint, and accept the fact that this is like almost, cybersecurity, right? You're just not going to know what's the next phishing attack going to be, or attack that comes from somewhere to exploit a vulnerability, to apply those same techniques to the AI models as well. To say, let's, adopt some sort of a red team approach, if you will, to figure out, where can we create situations, how can we create situations that expose vulnerabilities in the AI models, right? And then record those so we can further sort of follow up on research and investigate them and prevent them from happening again.
I'm curious, Martin, given you're coming from a testing perspective, testing company, are customers asking you about how do we test AI, or how are they bringing this topic up?
Every day.
Yeah.
Every day. We have these conversations almost all the time. We've seen companies establish a steering committee or a task force to really sort of figure out their own AI strategy as relates to using AI as a way to do business, as a way to incorporate AI to build products, to deliver products, to enhance the products, but also internally from a development standpoint of, how should we even use AI? Should we use things like GitHub Copilot to make our developers more productive, or to auto-generate things like unit tests, right? So there's so many nuances and variants of how machine learning and different forms of AI can be used, from computer vision to generative use cases to more specialized use cases. And that's a big topic. It's much, much bigger than anything we've ever seen before, including cloud and social media and all these other sort of generational sort of changes in technology, because it affects every single aspect of how we work and operate and run our business and our companies and interact with one another.
So, Martin, do you know that, this is just a nosy question for me, are they using like a risk assessment score or risk, exposure score? Because, I mean, depending on what you're doing, you may be able to take different levels of risk exposure, right? So if I'm building a nuclear system, it's probably a different risk exposure than if I'm trying to update maybe some marketing material.
Yeah, what we're seeing right now is, I think most companies are very, very cautious of how AI technologies can be used. I think everybody's still in this sort of learning and exploration mode, to test the capabilities of what's possible and how it can be used. But also they're working with the legal teams, with their ESG teams and others to figure out where are we within the sort of confinements of regulatory requirements or laws or other regulations that they have to deal with. I think the baby steps we're seeing is sort of AI augmented use cases. For example, LLMs are being used to summarize, meeting notes or user reviews. On, I don't know if Yelp is using it, but I've definitely seen sort of summaries that are clearly labeled as, generated by an AI or by ChatGPT specifically, based on the next 100 sort of user reviews, right? And so there are also sort of very clearly sort of the limitations of what was the context window of a prompt that was used to generate the summary, because clearly there were, in some cases, many more thousand reviews posted, but the summary was based on like a small subset of those reviews. So we're seeing sort of the baby steps in that direction to figure out like how can we enhance products and services through things that were difficult to do manually. And beyond that, it's still, sometimes I think companies are not even disclosing what they're doing really. And to your point about sort of the risk aspect of, we haven't talked to very many nuclear submarine companies and how they're using AIs to develop weapon systems, but That's actually one of the things that, especially with the EU AI Act, was clearly sort of an exception to say, well, countries have the ability to bypass, the laws in case of a threat to the public or terrorist attacks, or if there is sort of, a crime in progress and different sort of levels of, real time versus, post real time uses of AI. But it's, I think, I think somebody made the comment already that the laws are always going to catch up with technology. And we're definitely in that stage still to figure out what's possible and what's the best way to govern that.
Yeah, one of the questions we got that I published a link to earlier was asking, Umesh was asking about specific vulnerabilities. What are they for adversarial attacks? What are the best practices for defending them? And I think this is probably a relatively new area for many of us, is how we protect AI specific attacks. But this goes back to the OWASP top 10 for large language model applications. They have a really good chart in the document that takes the top 10 and then shows in sort of the development process or flow of information, whether it be plugins or code or LLM models, data storage, things like that. They take all 10 and they map it to what the vulnerabilities are, like a denial of service or prompt injection or prompt data poisoning. So too many for me for all of us to go over here, but that's a fantastic reference. Now, prescriptively, what do you do to protect against all those things? It doesn't necessarily describe that. But some things we have existing tools for, others maybe not. One of the questions that is also asked for our audience is, what are the key aspects of AI ethics, responsibility, and legal issues that we should cover in training of employees? There's a whole nother topic of what do our employees need to know in terms of the ethical use of AI? What are our responsibilities around that? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, a lot of big companies, at least like for like certain groups, they already have a security training, if you will, that teaches you like about PII data and about, like what all the different data types, if you will, right? And I think now all employees need to understand that and understand like how to safe keep that data, because if you accidentally leak that kind of data into like your model or into anything, like it's bad enough that it can get sent an email and go off somewhere, right? But now if you leak that into the model somehow, or somehow the model has access to it, that's a whole nother problem I think you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think that I do a lot of training for enterprises on how to use AI. And one of the first things I do is, and I think this is where it just echoes Alice's point, is you have to explain to them that you're not just processing your data, but it's very much like the Borg from Star Trek is, it can assimilate that data if you've not opted out of including it in training. The other thing is that it's beyond that is you've got to understand all of the ways that you are creating data. And so one thing in the news recently was, have they violated copyright by scraping the internet? So Sarah Silverman, the comedian, just brought that to court and it was thrown out. But on the other end of that, the US Copyright Office is saying that you require some level of human contribution to the end work. So there was a comic book where they generated all the images with a large language model, and the US Copyright said, well, those were generated with a large language model. I think it was Stable Diffusion or Midjourney. So that was not copyrightable. But when they put all these images together in a comic book, the comic book itself was copyrightable and trademarkable, not the superhero that was in essence created by a large language model without some human guiding it beyond the prompt. So that's that's a very, very nuanced thing. But when I look at very, takeaways is, if you're using these large language models to create copyrighted works and you're not doing significant editing, if you're using them to create logos for your business, not that there is a great test to determine that they've been generated by AI, but those kind of instances, you have to understand that you may be trying to trademark something or copyright something that is not able to be copyrighted, at least under US law as of today. That could very well change in the future.
The other thing I think would be is kind of interesting. So I'm finishing up my PhD in systems engineering, and doing things like systematic literature reviews and then generating new knowledge from that seems like an ideal use case for generative AI. But then is that ethical, right? Because academically, right, you're supposed to be contributing something new to the state of the practice, the state of the art, but actually you could potentially be doing that with generative AI, because you're uploading all of these materials and it's creating these correlations and things that could generate something new on its own, right? So is that, the whole education system and how students use AI, et cetera, seems like it needs to be rethought.
Interesting. Robin, when you're talking about, I'm curious about your systems engineering, because now you're working on your doctorate. Hope your paper is going really well, your research. Talk some more about systems engineering and incorporating AI into that. And are there any aspects of systems engineering? Imagine there are. We need to seriously rethink about how AI fits into that have jumped out to you as you're doing your work.
Well, it's incredibly powerful, right? It's really helpful. So here's the interesting thing. You can use AI to perform systems engineering, right? To develop models. And you can use systems engineering to improve AI. It's like this two-way impact. And so yes, it's interesting that I'm like, just right here, I just happen to be doing my dissertation at the same time. And yes, the entire approach needs to be reconsidered, rethought, and is actually incredibly helpful. I mean, because one of the things that I've been most interested in is how to use Agile and DevOps to apply them to safety critical cyber physical systems. And one of the weaknesses that has been in the literature before is things like traceability, assurance test cases, safety, things like that. And now you've got generative AI, which could actually solve some of those problems that existed.
Great. Anybody else have any comments on that?
Well, I do think that if you're going to create a model, like you should put that through like a DevOps, like a system cycle, if you will, right? Like you should apply DevOps to it. So you have better traceability of the model. You can better, keep track of what goes in, what comes out. Like we know it's unpredictable, but it is predictable to some point, right? And you need to do this for like all the phases, not just like, hey, we're going to do it for dev and QA and we're done. We're not going to do it for production. No, you need to go all the way through to production. And then as Robin was just saying, like, you need traceability. You need to be able to find a way to monitor it, all these things. Like, I really think that data engineers are going to have to move closer towards operations, because if we don't freeze the model, like if you still let it learn, like even after you go to production, like something you may not have picked up earlier, could it eventually show itself up, right, in production, because the model keeps learning, keeps changing, keeps growing, essentially, right? So
It's got
I think
emergent
there's a different
behavior.
risk. There's a different risk profile, whether you freeze the model or you don't freeze the model and you let it keep learning.
I think that all the practices that we already use as DevOps, of, continuous deployment, some of the newer practices like software supply chains. I think there's also needs to be a data supply chain as well,
Yes.
so that you understand that. And then your observability, and traceability that we've done in software. This is the hard part, because the way that these GANs and NANs and these adversarial networks of all types work a little differently. We don't have a lot of experience outside of the machine learning space. And then at the very end, you have what Martin and his team does. There are plenty of tests for bias, for data drift, things like that, that machine learning has all, that discipline of science has already come up with to test the models. But now we need to take the, domain knowledge and apply it to the systems there, whether you're running a test of, the question has come up a bit here in bias, is you will have sets of synthetic data with protected classes that you will run against these models. And these unit tests probably are very, very different than when you're doing a software build looking for debug errors. But all of these concepts do translate. It's just a little bit of retooling and expansion. But I'd be curious to hear, Martin, I'm sure you get the question. I'm like, do you have any answers today, or you think where we're going there?
I wish I'd had the answer, but I think what this discussion shows is that it's extremely complicated to provide consistent guidelines and even think about the different uses, because I think, Alice, you were talking mostly about sort of bias relative to how LLMs could, use toxic language or introduce bias or discrimination given certain prompts, right? If you think about AI-powered code generation capabilities, right? And how, if you look especially, was it last week or before, at the AWS reInvent and all the announcements that AWS has made. Since then, Google has tried to launch Gemini with some hiccups. Open AI, Microsoft, and others are not far behind in terms of how they're evolving their models to be more useful from a developer standpoint, in terms of migrating code bases from COBOL to Java, or to migrate from older versions of Java to new versions of Java, or any other use case relative to software development, right? The question in my mind is, where does the training data come from? If it's all based on open source, code commits that can easily be scanned and used for training purposes. Does it come from internally developed best practices? And here are our top developers and architects and how they develop systems, and that's going to be the gold standard for generating code completions and frameworks and other sort of code that other developers can use? Or is AI used more from a code review perspective, right? Because that's the other aspect of how AI can be useful, to say, before we make our commit or before we go live or have sort of like a deployment, we need to review our code and go through code reviews, right? For development best practices, for security vulnerabilities, we have to scan the code for, copyright infringement issues and other things that need to be tested for, right? And I think that is where it's much, much more difficult to figure out, okay, so where do we draw the line between what's acceptable use and what is violating certain policies or guidelines?
Martin, I almost wonder if we'll evolve to something similar to in security. We have people do pen testing, right? Come and test our stuff.
Yeah.
OpenAI had some of the earlier people that are part of the startup come back in and test. I think it was the 4.0 release, test it for safety. It was an acquiring power, that kind of thing. Maybe we'll have specialized services, people that can test your software for bias or for safety or for ethics. I don't know if all that's possible, but it seems like a lot of those are subjective, right? And it may be more of exposing what it is rather than testing it for something. And maybe that's a a new field of, we think about testing differently for that part. I don't know.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that there's this sort of emerging discipline of AI testing using like a red team approach, and which is very different from penetration testing, because I think AI testing will probably blow the time frame for any sort of agile DevOps deployment lifecycle, right? Because you just can't, accelerate, finding a needle in a haystack type way of saying, well, in this particular situation, given these prompts or these inputs, the AI model is generating, results that are not acceptable, right? It's too risky or toxic or any other sort of issue that we would have with it. And in a lot of ways, that requires human judgment, right? And I think that's something that I believe the EU AI Act has added or allowed for, which is human oversight and intervention, right? And I think like this human in the loop idea is going to be very important going forward, that we can't yet, at least for quite some time, rely blindly on the AI models to work as expected, right? So I think we're still far away from that, but I do think, Mitch, that there's going to be a new discipline similar to security, teams that will focus more on sort of the testing validation of AI models. And that could actually be elevated into some sort of like a CISO-like type organizational construct as well, where you have expertise, skill sets, and tools and methodologies to test and validate AI.
Okay, Martin brought up the topic. I was going to go there next, Mark. I know you want to. You can't wait to talk about the EU AI Act, and of course, we've had, in May, Biden announced the new actions to promote responsible AI, and I think it was in August or July that they came out with their safeguards for AI development. Of course, a lot of those aren't prescriptive, right? They're just ordering or telling agencies to do certain things to go define and develop things. But the EU Act is the most recent one, just having happened just a week ago. Your thoughts on regulation? How do we think about it right now? Where are we? And is there anything we should do to prepare ourselves? Or is it just kind of a wide open field for the next 3 years? And who knows what we're going to be doing to ourselves regulatory wise?
Before we go deep into that, I think I just want to reiterate on the fact of something Martin said about humans in the loop. So when you train these models, you often do reinforced learning with human feedback. So there's humans that actually qualify how they're trained. I think the thing that you're going to see is sort of human in the loop evaluation of these models, because even though they're good with sentiment, there's a lot of nuances that are just not going to be addressed without humans. Given the fact that I just advocated for humans and we're talking about humans regulating AI, I'm also going to contradict myself just a little bit in the fact that I can't name a very good example of emerging tech regulation that works. And I worked at one of the first commercial internet service providers in the 90s. And back then, there's a good parallel between the internet. Anyone could post anything on the internet, and some of that stuff was frankly terrible. And when we opened up the floodgates of global sharing, people's filters were instantly, down-regulated. Now we're in a similar situation with these large language models that, they're not nearly as sophisticated as humans. Their reasoning is that of perhaps a 3-year-old, as some of the research says. But because of the way they use some probability and randomness around how they put out things, they seem very, very human and very, very capable in ways that they really aren't. So I think that having a awareness that we need to provide a set of guidelines is great. I also very much worry that when we put guidelines up there, for emerging tech, it's like loading passengers onto a moving train. It's not a very, safe and, practical experience, especially because we're trying to anticipate. And when we have our regulators who probably are consulting with experts doing that till it gets through all the negotiations. Once you see how the sausage is made, you never want to eat sausage. And so, they're probably very good inputs, but till you try and get it to a point where it can become a law across, in the case of the EU, with a very, very diverse set of governments that all have to agree, rolling up into the parliament, the EU parliament, it's sort of a scary thing. And so I would hope that their regulations that come out are malleable. And that's probably my biggest criticism. There's ways to append legislation in those governments, but it can put things, like I look at GDPR. All GDPR did was, make everybody's mouse finger tired from clicking through those cookie warnings. Has it really done that much to preserve data privacy? Has the juice been worth the squeeze? And I would argue that, and another great example is the Canned Spam Act, which happened in the 2000s. And it did nothing to actually downregulate the amount of junk commercial email that came out. So until I see a good example of it, I'm going to be super skeptical. But I'll step off my soapbox. But I have a strong opinion on this, as you knew before you asked the question.
That's why I said I knew you were chomping at the bit to talk about this. Okay, open it up. Anybody else's thoughts? I mean, we're early in this process, so Robin.
One of the things that I've noticed, and just talking to people, depending on their level of maturity in technology, is exactly what Mark said. They're talking to these large language models like they're people. They actually feel trusted, like they're like a human that's giving them. And so I think it does provide a really false sense of security, given the fact that people believe they're having discussions with these models versus, they don't work like that. They don't think like that. And so, some level of being able to, make sure you take everything with a grain of salt, I think is going to be really important. But I also agree with Mark. I haven't seen, while they mean well, a really good regulated technology environment. And it could simply be that people that are typically in the business of, building regulations are not typically technologists or vice versa. And it's really hard to make that mapping.
There's a concept of transference too, right? I think whatever trust we've developed in our search engines, yes, there's bad things can happen, but we know kind of what to expect. I think many users use something like ChatGPT like they would a search engine, and don't really put the qualifications and context around it, and kind of give it the same level of trust that they might their search engine, not realizing that same prompt 5 times will give you 5
different answers.
Right. So it's a little bit of deceptive that the chat is the kind of first exposure we have to it, maybe is setting a bad precedence. So a couple of things about the EU, the EU regulation, and Mark, I'm relying on your email summary, by the way, from your newsletter, which was excellent. There's some obvious no-brainer kind of things, like, you need some kind of a risk management system that's mandatory to have that. You need transparency for users that they're interacting with an AI system. Doesn't mean people will do that, but I mean, it's an obvious kind of ask. Logging capabilities to ensure traceability and ethical documentation. We were just talking about, we don't know how AI models come up with these answers. The explainability of this is pretty difficult. In the time when that happened, that model has evolved maybe radically, from the point in time it doesn't in existence anymore to go back and kind of trace that kind of thing. And I think there was another one I was thinking about too that kind of stood out to me. Oh, it's that open source. Isn't that exempt in the EU's proposal? Is that right, Mark?
That's right. On Thursday, So the EU's final agreement came out Friday, but on the draft that they published Thursday, they were providing exemptions for open source research and some other things. And it's a 670-page document. So I read it all, or tried to, and let me tell you, it's the problem, and this is the problem with a piece of legislation that is not written for technology by deep technologists. It's a little nebulous and sort of, we need definitions of what is research. Is that research at a university level for academia? Is it research and development at a, for-profit endeavor? It's unclear, but the open source aspects of it. And the third thing is that, there's a lot of companies like even Meta's large language model Llama, which they call open, is not what would be considered open source by those who are familiar with what the open source definition is. It's a permissive license from Facebook, but it is not an open source license. So all of these things have a lack of precision that make it very, very difficult to say where these guidelines lay.
Other comments, thoughts on this? It's a wide open field right now.
And the irony is that they don't intend to fully implement that to 2025. And if anyone thinks about what's happened in the last year in AI, like ChatGPT just came out November 2022, and the world trade changed drastically. Like, is this legislation forward thinking enough to address what the 2025 AI landscape even looks like?
It's hard enough for us to be forward thinking enough, more or less, to say regulators writing regulation are going to be forward thinking enough. I mean, they're human, just like we are. Let's do this we're kind of coming up close to our end, and just a reminder to folks that we do have some gift cards that we're giving away, and the folks that have won those will be contacted by the Techstrong Learning team to get hold of that. And also, I'm going to post in a link to a conference that's coming up in 2 days, AI in Action. Techstrong is putting on some great speakers and panels, and a few of the folks that are here on those as well. So check that out, as well as, of course, support Tricentis, our sponsor here, and the technology that they provide, and be sure to visit Tricentis. The takeaway question to think about is, after talking about this, and we may talk about it more ourselves than maybe the average person, I don't know. If you were listening to this, kind of putting yourself in the audience shoes, what do you think the next set of steps that you would take to go back to your development organization or your product organization, or where you come from, governance organization, and say, I think there's some things we should go take a look at or start working on addressing? Not that all the answers are there, but this is where we should be investing some of our time. Anybody want to take a first crack at that?
I think beginning with just starting to learn. So while there's a huge number of organizations and people that have jumped on and are using the range of AI tools available, there's still a lot that maybe talk about it, but really just haven't had any context. I think developing a series of hypotheses and potentially experiments in your organization, just to kind of understand the impacts that it's having, and maybe doing some learning would be the number one place to start. I mean, it has huge, like we said, emergent behavior. We have unknowns that we haven't even considered yet. To me, the best place to start is to jump in and start learning.
Yeah, I would echo that. One of my favorite sayings is from Peter Drucker, who was the father of IT and modern management. And he said, the only skill of the 21st century that's needed is the ability to learn new skills. So I think that becomes so paramount for us right now when we there's lots of new technology that has come along over the years, and this one's almost a mandate for you to be, continue to be a productive, functional organization, is to learn about it, know where to learn, find those trusted sources, but continue to, keep an eye on it, because it's probably the most transformational technology. And that's even more so than the internet and the personal computer, because of the ability for it not just to enable work, but to do the work on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would echo what we're hearing from our customers that are putting together these tiger teams or task forces that are cross-functional in nature, because I think if you only rely on the engineering team or the product team to figure out like how AI can be used, then you'll get the engineering response, but not necessarily sort of the holistic response that also represents the point of view of a legal team or the HR team or the finance team or an ESG team or a GRC team or security team, right? And I think the most successful organizations that always look at it holistically to come up with a set of recommendations of how AI can be used in support of company initiatives on the R&D side, but also marketing, sales, customer service, but doing so in a holistic and ethical way is probably a good strategy for everybody else to think about as well. And I'd also think about, AI will definitely sort of help raise the starting point or the bar in terms of what you can do with sort of building blocks that are pre-generated for you. But keep in mind that the human in the loop should not be forgotten, and sort of probably you want to rely on them even more so to make sure that things are being done correctly and in a reasonable way.
Good. Alice, you want to jump in?
No, I mean, I kind of just echo what everybody else says. Like, that's really like the first step, learning, and then make sure all the orgs are involved and not just your tech team or whatever, because all their inputs is very important to like basically like what they care about, right? Legal cares about make sure the company's not going to, get in legal trouble. HR cares about, the all the employees and all this other thing. You just need to take into account all the opinions, whether you like it or not. But I would say, secondly, like after you have some of that figured out and stuff, like you now need to really evaluate like what data you will and will not use in these models. And I think like most companies don't actually have like a data policy per se, but I would really think that if you're going to ever think about using like generative AI or AI, you really need to start thinking about that and figuring out like if people consent to you using that and all this other stuff, which is probably an entire another can of worms.
We talk about ethical AI, and how many of us have an ethics policy as an organization, right? Probably
Yeah.
relatively few. Who wants to jump in next? I think Mark, you're up. I caught you off guard there.
Sorry about that. My dog was barking and I just turned off the microphone. But I mean, I think the big takeaway from all of this is just we don't know what we don't know, and that as we move forward, that all of these are such good questions. I think that and everybody, like I would like to think my opinion is right, but my opinion is only informed by what I do. And what I do is talk to other people who are doing AI. And I am not on the hook for running production services or keeping reliability or uptime. So I think, as I listen to everyone sort of summarizing here is there's an idea of new language models that just came out this week called mixture of experts. I think that's interesting because it combines all of these experts in certain disciplines into a large language model. I think you need a mixture of experts who are not an algorithm, but humans, whether it's people like Martin who have expertise in, deployment, or people like Alice who's been jockeying data, or, Robin who has done all this research in security and everything else under the sun. And I think the best thing is that I can say is look for those mixture of experts that are, holistic across everything your AI is going to touch, and not, as smart as all of us are individually. Collectively, I think those opinions are going to be more and more important as we move along.
Very
and
good.
Woodford thinks so as well. He just barked.
Good for Woodford. Martin, did you get to go? I was answering a question in chat. Did you get your parting thought in?
Oh, I did. And I'm seeing one more question in chat about the Gen AI to build test cases. I think I covered that a little bit already in my comments, but we're doing this already today. You can already click on the generate with AI button in some of our test management tools to generate steps from test cases and the requirements. I think that's going to continue to evolve as well. And then there's going to be many more use cases for Gen AI around load and performance, security testing, compliance, functional verification, end-to-end of a business process, discovery of things of business processes, and using those insights to automate testing. So we'll definitely see a lot more of those use cases.
Excellent. Well, I wish we had a lot more time because we could talk about this a lot more. One parting thought I would add is I think this is very much a case for hands-on and heads up, meaning go in and you learn by doing. I mean, that's one of the best ways. But the other way is looking for people who are making strides, and that's a good practice. That's a good model. Let's learn from folks that are working on some of these problems. Could be another vendor, could be another software development team, might be a standards group or an organization, open source project, whatever it might be. There's a lot of good ideas, and we're all working on different aspects of this, and we can't figure it out on our own. So let's do this together. Let's go far together with AI. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. A super big thanks to all of our panelists, Robin, Alice, Mark, and Martin. And thanks to Tricentis very much for sponsoring our program today. All registrants will get an email with a link to the recording. So you're welcome. If you missed something, want to go back and check it out, want to share it with a friend, please do so. And we thank you for attending with us today. So on behalf of the Techstrong Learning team, all of our panelists, thanks for joining us. We look forward to our next panel, DevOps Unbound, and be sure to check out AI in Action that's happening tomorrow. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.